The fire was still smoldering in the yard when 14-year-old Emily Carter was pushed out through the front door of her aunt's farmhouse, carrying nothing but her dead mother's coat and a pair of boots 2 sizes too large. Behind her, the last pages of her father's journals were curling into black ash, and Aunt Beatrice stood on the porch with her arms crossed, watching the smoke as though it were something righteous. "No more nonsense under my roof," Beatrice said. "Your father filled your head with foolishness, and I will not have it poisoning my home. Now find your own way." It was November 1942, deep in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky, and the sky was already the color of iron. Emily stood at the edge of a dirt road, 14 years old, completely alone, watching the only home she had left disappear behind her aunt's slammed door. To understand how Emily Carter came to be standing in the cold with nothing, you need to understand where she came from. Her father, David Carter, was a schoolteacher and amateur botanist, a man who believed that knowledge was the one thing no one could ever take away. He kept shelves of books in their little cabin outside Willow Creek, Kentucky. Books on agriculture, chemistry, bread-baking traditions from Europe and the old country. Her mother, Sarah, was the finest baker in the county, a woman who could turn a handful of cornmeal and a bit of fat into something that tasted like a dish from a fine city kitchen. Sarah believed that bread was a language. She said you could feel whether it was made with love or out of obligation. And she taught Emily to tell the difference before the girl could see over the counter. When influenza took both David and Sarah in the winter of 1940, Emily was 12. She was sent to live with Aunt Beatrice, her mother's older sister. A hard woman, married to an even harder man named Harold, who ran a failing tobacco farm. Beatrice had never approved of David Carter, a man who read books instead of plowing fields, who taught his daughter algebra and the Latin names of plants. In Beatrice's world, a girl was supposed to know how to scrub floors, tend livestock, and keep her mouth shut. Emily could do the first 2, but would not, and could not do the third. For 2 years, Emily lived in that house, like a shadow. She did the expected work, fed the chickens, hauled water, scrubbed laundry on the washboard until her fingers cracked and bled. But she also read. She had managed to save a small box of her father's books and journals, and she hid them under a loose floorboard beneath her cot in the attic. At night, by the thin light of a candle stub, she read about soil composition, about the science of fermentation, about how wild yeasts live in the air around us, invisible and alive. She read about the great bakers of Vienna who used underground ovens to maintain stable temperatures. She read about root cellars and how the earth itself can be a furnace if you understand its principles. Beatrice found the books on a Tuesday morning in November. Emily had been careless. She had left one of her father's journals open on her cot, a page about sourdough and the chemistry of gluten development. Beatrice could not read well, but she recognized the handwriting and she recognized defiance. By the time Emily came back from the henhouse, the books were burning in the yard and Beatrice was waiting on the porch. "I told you when you came here," Beatrice said. "No more of this. Your father's books made him useless, and I will not have you turning out the same. You think you're better than us. You always have. Well, go be better somewhere else." Harold didn't even come outside. He just sat in his chair by the stove and let it happen. The neighbors saw. Not one of them said a word. If you want to know how a 14-year-old girl turned out with nothing but a coat and her mother's recipes in her memory, built something that eventually fed 3 villages through the hardest winters anyone could remember, subscribe to this channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Emily Carter built in those mountains is one of the most remarkable stories of survival and generosity you will ever hear. Emily walked. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving or the cold would kill her. The temperature was already dropping, and the sky had that heavy, pressing look that meant snow. She pulled her mother's coat tighter around herself. It was too large for her, cut for a grown woman, and the sleeves hung past the tips of her fingers, but it faintly smelled of Sarah, flour, wood smoke, and lavender. And that smell was the only thing keeping Emily from sitting down in the road and giving up. She followed an old logging road that wound up the mountain beyond Willow Creek, because it was the only direction that led away from the people who had watched her books burn and said nothing. She passed the Dawson farm, where Mrs. Dawson was hanging laundry, and saw Emily walking alone without a bag, without supplies, without anything. Mrs. Dawson paused, a wet shirt in her hands, looked at the girl, and then turned back to her line. She did not call out, did not ask where Emily was going. She simply looked away. And that small act of seeing and choosing not to see was something Emily remembered for the rest of her life. She walked for hours. The road narrowed to a path, the path to a deer trail. And the deer trail disappeared into a thicket of rhododendron so dense it blocked the wind. The light was fading and the first snowflakes were falling, small and dry, the kind that meant serious cold. Emily's feet were numb inside the oversized boots. Her hands were shaking. She knew, with the calm certainty of a girl who had read her father's books on wilderness survival, that she needed shelter within the hour or she would not survive the night. She pushed through the rhododendron, scratching her hands and face on the thick waxy leaves, and came out the other side into a clearing she had never seen. Cut into the hillside was a stone structure, half buried in the earth, with a heavy wooden door hanging on one hinge. It looked as though someone had dug a room into the mountain itself and built inside it. A stream ran nearby over a flat rock, and above, the slope rose sharply, covered in old hardwood trees. Emily could see the remains of a chimney pipe poking through the earth above the structure, and a set of stone steps leading down to the door. She opened the door and stepped inside, and the first thing she noticed was the warmth, not heat. There was no fire, no stove, but the air inside was noticeably warmer than outside. The earth itself was insulating the space, maintaining a stable temperature that Emily's father would have called constant. That unchanging warmth deep underground that stays the same regardless of the season above. The room was about 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, with stone walls and a packed earthen floor. Built into the far wall was a stone hearth with a chimney pipe rising through the hillside. A wooden shelf ran along one wall, and on it sat several rusted tins, a cracked bowl, and, Emily's heart lurched, an old cast-iron Dutch oven, still solid despite years of neglect. There was a wooden table, rough-hewn but sturdy, and a bench. In the corner was a pile of old burlap sacks that might once have been a bed. Emily later learned the history of this place. It had been built 20 years earlier by a man named Benjamin Hale, a miner who had come to the mountains in the last days of iron ore extraction. Benjamin understood the earth. He had built this dugout as a root cellar and shelter, using the natural insulation of the hillside to maintain a constant temperature year-round. He had lined the walls with stone to prevent collapse, and built the hearth with a chimney that drew beautifully due to the natural draft created by the temperature difference between the underground room and the outside air. Benjamin had died in a mine collapse in 1928, and his shelter had been forgotten by everyone except the deer and the foxes. But Emily didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that she was out of the wind, the cast-iron pot was solid, and the hearth looked like it would hold a fire. She gathered wood from fallen branches outside, and by sunset, she had a small fire going and a roof over her head. That first night was the loneliest of her life. She lay on the burlap sacks, listening to the wind howl overhead while the fire crackled, and she wept for her mother and her father and the books that were now ash. But even crying, her mind was working. She thought about the stable temperature of the underground room. She remembered what her father had written about the old European bakers who used underground ovens. She thought about her mother's sourdough starter, about the way Sarah had kept it alive for years in a crock on the back of the stove, feeding it flour and water, talking to it as though it were a living thing. Because it was a living thing. Wild yeasts, caught from the air, cultivated and fed through patience and attention. Emily nearly died in the first week. She had no food, and the woods in November offered little. She ate the inner bark of birch trees, which her father had taught her was edible. She found a patch of late watercress growing along the stream. She caught one trout with her bare hands, a feat that took most of a day and left her soaked to the bone. She shivered through nights that dropped below freezing above ground, though in her underground room with a banked fire the temperature remained bearable. On the 8th day, she found flour. It was in a tin, buried under a pile of rocks behind the shelter. Benjamin Hale's emergency cache, sealed tight and dry. It was old, but it was flour. Not much, maybe 10 pounds. But to Emily, it was a miracle. She also found a small tin of salt and a jar that had once held molasses, with a sticky residue inside. And then the idea took shape. Not just survival, something more. Emily remembered everything her mother had taught her, and everything her father had written. She knew that sourdough starter could be created from nothing but flour, water, and time. Wild yeasts in the air would colonize the mixture if you were patient. She knew that the underground room maintained a temperature nearly ideal for fermentation. She knew that the stone hearth, if she built it correctly, could function as a baking oven. The thermal mass of the stone and earth would hold heat for hours after the fire burned down, creating the stable, even baking temperature her mother had always called the secret to great bread. She mixed flour and water in the cracked bowl and set it on the shelf. Then she waited. It took 6 days. On the 6th morning, the mixture was bubbling, alive with wild yeasts floating in the mountain air. Emily fed it more flour and water. And by the 8th day, she had a starter that smelled the way her mother's kitchen used to smell. Sour and sweet and alive. Her first loaf was terrible. Dense, gummy in the center, with a crust that could have driven nails. But it was bread, and she ate it with tears running down her face, because it tasted like her mother. She could almost hear Sarah's voice in that underground room, saying what she always said when bread failed. Well, the yeast knows what it's doing even when we don't. Try again tomorrow. She baked again and again. She kept a mental log of every variable. How much water, how much the dough had risen, how hot the oven was when she put the bread in. She learned to read the dough with her hands, the way her mother had, feeling the moment it transformed from a shaggy, sticky mass into something smooth, alive, and elastic under her fingers. Each loaf was better than the last. She learned the rhythms of the underground oven, how long to burn the fire before raking out the coals, how to test the temperature by holding her hand inside and counting, how to use steam from a pan of water to create the crackling crust her mother had been famous for. She discovered that the hard mountain water, rich with minerals from the limestone streambed, gave the bread a flavor and texture that soft water never could. By the end of November, she was baking loaves that would have made Sarah Carter proud. But bread requires flour, and Benjamin Hale's emergency cash was running out. Emily needed a plan. That plan came in the form of Mrs. Agnes Reed, a 72-year-old woman living alone in a cabin 3 miles down the mountain. Agnes had been a midwife for 40 years and knew every hollow and ridge in those mountains. She knew about Benjamin Hale's dugout. She had delivered Benjamin's wife's baby there in 1926. And when she noticed a thin thread of smoke rising from a slope where no smoke should be, she came to investigate. Agnes found Emily baking bread in the underground room and didn't bat an eye. She was the kind of woman who had seen too much of life to be surprised by anything. She sat down on the bench, accepted a piece of bread, chewed it slowly, and said, "Your mama teach you this?" "Yes, ma'am. She taught you well." Agnes became Emily's salvation. She brought flour, cornmeal, lard, and salt. Not charity, she insisted, but in exchange. Because Agnes had bad knees and could no longer bake, and she missed good bread. She also brought Emily a wool blanket, a proper knife, and something even more valuable, knowledge. Agnes knew which plants in the mountain forest were edible, which were medicinal, and which would kill you. She taught Emily to recognize ramps in spring, to gather black walnuts in autumn, to dry apples on a rack over the fire. She taught her how to make ash cakes and pone bread, and the type of chestnut flour the old mountain people had used before the blight killed the American chestnuts. In exchange, Emily baked and experimented. The underground room, with its constant temperature, was ideal not only for baking but for fermentation of all kinds. She began making vinegar from wild apples. She fermented sauerkraut from the wild cabbage growing along the stream bottom. She discovered that the back corner of the underground room, where the temperature was coolest, was perfect for aging cheese, if she could get milk. Agnes arranged that too, trading a neighbor's goat milk for bread. Through that first winter, Emily nearly died twice more. Once from a fever that Agnes treated with willow bark tea and an herbal compress. Once from a partial collapse of the dugout entrance after a heavy snowfall that trapped her inside for 2 days before Agnes came looking. But every crisis taught her something. She reinforced the entrance with heavy timbers scavenged from an old barn. She built a second ventilation shaft to prevent being trapped again. She laid in stores of firewood and dried food against future emergencies. By spring of 1943, Emily was not merely surviving. She had built a functioning underground bakery. She had expanded the original room by digging deeper into the hillside to create a second chamber for storage. She had built a proper baking oven inside the hearth using flat stream stones that held heat beautifully. She had fashioned a simple wooden trough for kneading dough and carved a peel from an oak plank for sliding loaves in and out of the oven. Word spread the way it does in mountain communities. Slowly, through the conversations of old women and the curiosity of children. A hunter named Oliver Grant followed the smell of baking bread up the mountain one April morning and found Emily pulling loaves from her underground oven. He traded her 2 rabbits for bread and told everyone in Willow Creek about the girl living in the mountain who baked bread like an angel. Some people laughed, some shook their heads. A few came to see for themselves. What they found astonished them. By summer of 1943, Emily had not only a bakery, but a garden. She had cleared the ground around the dugout entrance and planted seeds Agnes had given her: beans, squash, tomatoes, herbs. She had built a series of small terraces on the hillside using a stone wall technique her father had described in one of the burned journals. Knowledge she had carried in her memory even after the pages were gone. She diverted water from the stream through a simple channel to irrigate the garden. She was 15 years old and feeding herself entirely from what she grew and baked. The first people who came to trade were the poorest families from the surrounding hollows. People who had less than nothing, surviving on cornbread and desperation. Emily turned no one away. If they had nothing to trade, she gave them bread anyway. If they had a handful of dried beans or a few eggs, she took those. She kept a mental account, but never demanded payment. Her mother had taught her that bread was meant to be shared, and she held to that teaching like a commandment. By 1944, Emily's underground bakery was supplying bread to families in 3 communities: Willow Creek, Oak Ridge, and the tiny settlement of Fern Valley. She had expanded her production to 4 types of bread: her mother's sourdough, a dark rye made from grain she traded with a farmer in the valley, a cornbread sweetened with sorghum, and a chestnut bread made from the flour Agnes had taught her. She also produced fermented vegetables, vinegar, and a soft goat cheese that people walked miles for. She did all of this from an underground room in the side of a mountain, using techniques that combined her father's scientific knowledge, her mother's baking traditions, and her own relentless experimentation. The underground environment gave her advantages no above-ground bakery could match. The constant temperature meant her sourdough starter never died from the cold or overheated in summer. The thermal mass of the earth and stone meant the oven held a stable baking temperature for hours. The natural humidity of the underground space kept bread fresher longer than any bread baked in a dry kitchen. And then came the winter of 1944, the worst winter anyone in the Appalachian Mountains could remember. Snow fell for weeks without stopping. Temperatures dropped so low that trees cracked with sounds like gunshots. Livestock froze in barns. Roads became impassable, and food ran out. In Willow Creek, people were starving. The families who had looked down on Emily, who had watched Beatrice burn her books and said nothing, who had whispered about the strange girl living in the mountain. Those families were now desperate. Their root cellars were empty. Their flour was gone. Their children were hungry. Emily heard about it from Oliver Grant, who snowshoed up the mountain to tell her. She did not hesitate. She had spent the autumn laying in stores of flour, cornmeal, and dried goods, preparing for winter the way her father's journals had taught her. With the careful planning of someone who understood that nature is generous but not forgiving, she had enough to see herself through to spring. She also had enough to share. For 6 weeks, Emily baked through the nights. Each night, she produced dozens of loaves a day: sourdough, cornbread, rye, and Oliver with 2 other trusted men carried them down the mountain on sleds to distribute to families in all 3 villages. She sent jars of fermented vegetables and crocks of cheese. She sent dried herbs for tea. She sent everything she could spare and some things she couldn't. Among the families she fed were Beatrice and Harold. Their tobacco crop had failed the previous summer and they had nothing in reserve. When Beatrice received bread from Emily, delivered by Oliver Grant with a simple note reading, "From Emily," she sat down at her kitchen table and wept. Spring came, the snow melted, and people climbed the mountain not only to trade, but to learn. They wanted to know how a girl alone in an underground room had been the only person in 3 villages who was prepared for the worst winter in memory. Emily taught them. She showed them how to build root cellars that maintained constant temperatures. She taught fermentation, how to preserve cabbage, beans, and turnips to last through winter. She shared her sourdough starter, giving portions to anyone who wanted to learn to bake. She taught the science behind the traditions, the way her father would have, explaining why things work, not only how. She drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick, showing how heat moves through stone and earth, showing why a properly insulated root cellar stays 55 degrees whether it's 90 above or 20 below. The men nodded slowly. The women took notes on scraps of paper. The children watched with wide eyes. And Emily saw in some of those children the same hunger she had felt. The hunger to understand, to know why, to see the invisible mechanisms of the world. She helped 12 families build underground root cellars that spring and summer. She showed them how to orient them on north-facing slopes for natural cooling, how to line them with stone for thermal mass, how to set ventilation pipes so the air stayed fresh. She taught them to think about food storage not as a chore, but as a science. And the families who listened, truly listened, never went hungry again. Beatrice came to see her in April 1945. She climbed the mountain path slowly, her bad hip making the journey painful, and she stood at the entrance to Emily's underground bakery and looked at what her niece had built. She did not apologize. Beatrice was not a woman who had those words. But she said, "Your mama would be proud of you. I was wrong about the books." It was the closest thing to an apology Emily would ever receive, and she accepted it with a nod and a fresh loaf of bread, still warm from the oven. Emily Carter never left her mountain. Over the years, she expanded the underground bakery into a complex of rooms: a baking chamber, a fermentation room, a cheese cave, a root cellar, and a teaching kitchen where she showed young people the crafts she had mastered. In 1949, she married a man named Michael Lawson, a quiet carpenter who had first come up the mountain to fix her door and stayed because he recognized in Emily a strength he had never seen before. Together, they had 3 children, and all of them grew up knowing how to bake bread, tend a garden, and read books without apology. In the war years, the bakery became even more important. With rationing and shortages affecting everyone, her sourdough bread, which required no commercial yeast, sugar, or milk, became a staple for families across the region. She trained dozens of women in sourdough baking, and her starter, descended from that first batch she had cultivated in a cracked bowl in 1942, spread across 3 counties. Mrs. Agnes Reed died in 1951 at the age of 81 in her cabin, with Emily at her side. She left Emily her cabin, her land, and a cigar box containing $47, a fortune by mountain standards. Emily used the money to buy a proper millstone and began grinding her own flour from local grain, completing the cycle of self-sufficiency her father would have marveled at. By the 1960s, Emily's underground bakery had become a legend. People came from as far away as Louisville and Lexington to buy her bread. A professor from the University of Kentucky came to study her underground baking methods and published a paper on the thermal properties of earth shelters, citing Emily's bakery as one of the most efficient food production environments he had ever documented. A newspaper in Frankfurt printed a story about her with the headline, "Mountain Woman Bakes Bread Underground." And for a few weeks, Emily had more customers than she could serve. But she never commercialized the operation. She never moved to town. She never built an above-ground bakery with modern equipment, though she could have afforded to. She stayed in her mountain in the underground rooms, baking bread the way her mother had taught her, and teaching anyone who wanted to learn. She said bread tasted better when it was baked in the earth. And perhaps she was right. People who tried it said there was something in it that couldn't be named. A depth, a complexity, a warmth that came from somewhere beyond the recipe. Emily believed it was the mountain itself. The wild yeast that had lived in that hollow for centuries. The mineral water from the limestone stream. The steady heartbeat of the earth's warmth around the oven. She believed the bread carried the mountain inside it. And that was why people kept coming back. In the 1970s, Emily began a tradition that outlasted her. Every Saturday morning, she baked an extra dozen loaves and gave them away free to anyone who climbed the mountain path. She called it her mother's bread, and she made only one request of the people who took it, that they share something they knew with someone who needed to learn. A skill, a recipe, a story, a piece of knowledge. She said that was the true currency. Not money, not flour, not goods to trade, but knowledge, passed from hand to hand the way her father had passed it to her, the way her mother had placed her small hands on a ball of dough and shown her what bread could be. Emily Carter died in her sleep in the winter of 2005 at the age of 77, in the cabin that had once been Agnes Reed's. Her sourdough starter, by then 63 years old, was divided among her 3 children and 14 grandchildren. Her underground bakery is preserved as a local heritage site, and her family still operates it today, baking bread every Saturday morning using Emily's original recipes in her original oven. The air in that oven is still seeded with the same wild yeasts Emily caught from the mountain air in 1942. Those same invisible living things, to which a frightened girl in a dead man's root cellar had entrusted the transformation of flour and water into bread, into survival, into life. This is what I think about when I think about Emily Carter. I think about a girl whose books were burned, and who carried the knowledge from those books in her memory. I think about a girl who was told she was too curious, too different, too much, and who turned out to be exactly enough. I think about the fact that every quality Beatrice despised in Emily, her reading, her questions, her refusal to stop learning, was precisely the quality that saved not only Emily's life, but the lives of the people who had rejected her. Has anyone ever told you that what makes you different makes you wrong? Have you ever been punished for your curiosity, for wanting more, for refusing to make yourself small? Because if so, Emily Carter's story is your story too. There will always be people in the world who want to burn your books. The question is whether you carry the knowledge with you anyway. Emily didn't build her underground bakery to prove anyone wrong. She built it to survive. But in surviving, she proved something no one could argue with: that the girl they had cast out was the one who fed them all. If this story resonated with you, if you know what it is to be underestimated or cast aside, subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Share it with someone who needs to hear that being different is not a flaw. It is a gift. Because Emily Carter, the girl who was turned out for loving books, spent 63 years baking bread underground. And all that time, she never once stopped feeding the people who had let her go.